The Pacific region is actually an incredibly important region for understanding human evolution because we have some of the earliest evidence of modern human presence outside of Africa in the Australia and New Guinea area. And of course, we have the last major migration resulting in the settlement of Polynesia. We have to remember that when humans left Africa 65,000 years ago or so, the landscape was quite different, and the fact that sea levels were quite a lot lower than they are today, because during these periods of ice ages, the ocean water was being sucked up at the North and the South Pole, lowering the sea levels and connecting what today are islands, the islands of Southeast Asia, to the larger Asian mainland, into a landmass that we refer to as Sunda. And Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania were joined together in a great southern landmass we refer to as Sahul. But Sunda and Sahul were always separated by an area of islands and deep water trenches. We refer to this as Wallacea, or Wallace's line defines this region that always separated Sunda and Sahul at the time period that we're talking, until about 10,000 years ago. The earliest archaeological evidence that we have for people arriving in Sahul, the greater southern continent, dates to at least 50,000 years ago. And we have archaeological sites all over that continental landmass that date to about that period in time. So we know that people arrived there at least 50,000 years ago. We also see from the DNA perspective a range of mitochondrial lineages belonging to haplogroups S, O, P, and Q, which tells us that this was probably a relatively large and genetically diverse population that arrived in Sahul at that point in time. While the dates of 50,000 years ago for the settlement of Sahul are generally well accepted and fit in nicely with what we would expect from the out-of-Africa dates of leaving Africa about 65,000 years ago, the recent discoveries at a site called Majabebe in northern Australia, which perhaps date as early as 65,000 years ago, really push that date backwards and cause some complications. If people are only leaving Africa 65,000 years ago, how could they get to Australia that quickly? And interestingly, both from ancient DNA, from archaeological remains in Australia, and from modern analyses of Aboriginal genomes, we can indeed see that we have this incredible deep history of at least 50,000 years and continuous settlement and connections between the first people who arrived in Sahul and Australian Aboriginal and New Guinea highland populations today. So this is consistent with oral traditions as well, although the actual timing of that in the 50 to 65,000 year old range is still somewhat in debate. The settlement of Sahul and the islands of the Bismarck Archipelago go back into deep time and range from 40 to possibly 65,000 years ago. The rest of the Pacific, what we refer to as remote Oceania, wasn't settled until the last 3,000 or slightly more than that, 3,500 years ago, and the settlement of remote Oceania that continues on to the settlement of the Polynesian Triangle. So the settlement of remote Oceania is associated with the Neolithic expansion of people through island Southeast Asia, probably beginning around 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, including people moving through Taiwan and island Southeast Asia and arriving in the Bismarck Archipelago about 3,300 years ago, and then moving out into remote Oceania, into islands that have never been settled before, where they are the first people to arrive. And they extend all the way as far as the edge of the Polynesian Triangle in Samoa and Tonga, where they arrive about 2,900 years ago. This Neolithic expansion out of island Southeast Asia is also linked to the spread of Austronesian languages, which have been traced back to Taiwan, and in particular, the Oceanic subgroup of Austronesian languages are shared by all of the populations of Polynesia and Oceania, the islands in Oceania, through the north coast of New Guinea. The highland populations, however, speak Papuan languages, which are much more ancient and much more diverse. Archaeologically, this Neolithic expansion is identified through the Lapita cultural complex, or the artifacts and things that the people carried with them. And in particular, the most obvious is the Lapita pottery, the particular dentate, stamped, designed pottery that these people carried with them through the Bismarck Archipelago and out to the edge of the Polynesian Triangle in Samoa and Tonga. So the people who transported the Lapita cultural complex, the Lapita peoples we might call them, transported in their large double-hulled canoes all of the plants and animals and objects that they needed to establish their new settlements on the islands of remote Oceania. And so we can actually use the DNA of the plants and animals that people carried with them as proxies for tracking the movement of the people themselves. And we can compare those results to the DNA of the people across the Pacific. And all of this helps us reconstruct the process of island settlement from step A to B to C and potentially back and forth. And so by looking at the DNA evidence from the plants and animals and the people, we can start to get a picture of how people moved across the Pacific. So this, for example, shows the human mitochondrial DNA variation, and we can see how particular lineages came through in the early phase of human settlement of the Pacific, and then new lineages come out with this Neolithic expansion. So we see haplogroup B coming across the Pacific with the Lapita peoples. When we look at the DNA, for example, of the people who live in the Bismarck Archipelago today, the place where we see the earliest Lapita archaeological sites, we actually see a mixture of mitochondrial DNA lineages from the first peopling of Sahul, people carrying the P, the Q, and the M haplogroups, representing those ancient populations. And then we see also the appearance of increasing numbers of haplogroup B, which we think are the lineages that are carried from Asia, from island Southeast Asia, that actually get taken out into the remote Pacific. But of those Asian lineages, B and E we see in the Bismarck Archipelago, only B goes out to remote Oceania. Between 2004 and 2009, archaeologists excavated an amazing archaeological site in Vanuatu, a site called Teuma, where they found the cemetery of the first Lapita peoples to arrive in Vanuatu about 3,000 years ago, and they have the remains of more than 70 individuals buried at this site. None of them have their skulls, however, so it appears that the skulls were being removed once the bodies were decomposed, and we don't know exactly why, but we do know in the region there is a history of ancestor worship, and often the skulls were taken to skull shrines that were involved in that kind of religious activity. So while none of the 70-odd individuals have their skulls buried with them, there are 5 skulls that were discovered in the site, all of them in ceremonial positions. So one individual had 3 skulls across their chest. None of these skulls actually belonged to the person that they were buried with. In 2016, a group of researchers were able to obtain ancient DNA from the ceremonial skulls from Teuma. And what they found was that DNA, and that was their entire nuclear DNA as well as their mitochondrial DNA, did not look like the people living in Vanuatu today, but looked very much like populations from island Southeast Asia. In 2018, the same group started looking at DNA from skeletons and archaeological sites that are a few hundred years after Teuma, that date to about 2,500 years ago, and they see that the people living then do have the same DNA as the people living in Vanuatu today. So what they suggest was that the Lapita people came directly from island Southeast Asia and then were replaced by people who came out of near Oceania, from the Bismarck Archipelago, for example, and replaced those Lapita people within a few hundred years. The settlement of the rest of the Polynesian Triangle was the last major human migration event, and that occurred about 2,000 years after people arrived in Samoa and Tonga. So the expansion into the Polynesian Triangle begins about 1,000 or 1,200 years ago, and we have people moving up to Hawaii, out to Rapa Nui, and finally to Aotearoa, New Zealand, about 750 years ago. One of the earliest archaeological sites in New Zealand is the site of Warabar that's located at the top of the South Island in the Blenheim region. And this is a large village site which dates to about 730 years ago, and it contains the burials of more than 40 individuals. And we have actually been able to obtain the DNA from some of these individuals prior to their reburial or repatriation at the site in 2009. Since 2009, we've actually been studying the DNA of the Tupuna, the ancestors from Warabar, these burials from the site. And what we found is that there is much more mitochondrial DNA variation than anybody anticipated. So while all of the lineages belong to the B4A1A haplogroup or subhaplogroup, we found significant variation within that group. And we now have many, many, many lineages within the B4 lineage, which indicates that the founding population had probably more than 100 women in the founding population. So in addition to studying the mitochondrial DNA and the DNA of the first New Zealanders from Warabar, we've also been looking at the DNA variation that we see in New Zealanders today, because of course Māori were the first to arrive, but they were followed after a few hundred years by people from Europe, from Asia, and from the Pacific Islands. And so as part of the Africa Te Aotearoa project, we've been able to actually reconstruct the various historic migrations. And what we see is the combination of Polynesian lineages, of European lineages, mostly coming out of the UK, and some Asian lineages that have come in more recently. And all of this makes up the incredibly diverse populations that we see today. And so we actually have found that we have all of the major mitochondrial lineages in our New Zealand population living in Aotearoa today.